Thank you very much. So, thank you very much to the Academy of Athens for inviting me here and for all the hospitality. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for tuning in. So, in the talk that I gave yesterday, I spoke about Pierre Hadot's idea of philosophy as a way of life, and whether Aristotle can fit into that paradigm or not. And broadly speaking, I was arguing that Aristotle probably doesn't fit into that paradigm. And so there was a sense in which I was being critical of Hadot and suggesting that perhaps he was pushing his case too far in that particular instance. So what I want to do today is, in a sense, redress the balance and say something much more positive about Pierre Hadot's work and the way in which it might be incredibly valuable and useful for us to reassess the philosophical standing of a range of thinkers throughout the history of philosophy. So if yesterday I was a bit critical of Pierre, today I want to champion his work and his approach and show ways in which we can learn from it. And what I want to do is, rather than think about ancient philosophy this time, is think about some slightly more recent philosophers. And the people I have in mind are a group of Italian thinkers that are regularly referred to as Renaissance humanists. And as we'll see in a moment, that's potentially a difficult label, but we'll come to that in a moment. The people that I've got in mind are Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch as he's normally known in English, active in the 14th century, and a series of others active in the 15th century that follow him. Coluccio Salutati, Leonardo Bruni, Poggio Bracciolini, Bartolomeo Scala, and many others. Now, these figures are often neglected in standard histories of philosophy. They're either ignored or explicitly deprecated as not really serious philosophers at all. They were, on one view, scholars of the ancient world, often poets, philologists, historians, but not really philosophers. Petrarch's polemics against the Aristotelians of his day and his dismissal of the scholastic tradition in the universities has sometimes been read as a rejection of serious philosophy as such on his part. The famous scholar of this period, Paul Christella, once commented that the humanists were not really philosophers at all. Later in his career, he modified that claim by saying that they did have some interests in moral philosophy, but not much else. More recent commentators have challenged his view, pointing to examples of humanists who were engaged in logic and physics alongside ethics. And on this more recent view, humanism doesn't necessarily signify a specific set of interests, but instead a certain approach or method that could be applied to almost any subject. And we might call this a broadly historicist approach. So the humanists on this view were interested in antiquity, but not necessarily in philosophy. In particular, they were interested in recovering neglected texts, hunting for books in monasteries, and in the case of Petrarch, exploring a range of ancient authors that he thought had been somewhat neglected. It is in this sense that they were Renaissance thinkers, promoting a rebirth of interest in neglected aspects of classical antiquity. However, the idea of Renaissance philosophy as such has recently been challenged by a number of medievalists who've argued that in reality, there was no great rebirth of learning in Italy in this period. So these medievalists will argue that the favorite authors of the humanists, in particular Cicero and Seneca, had been read throughout the Latin Middle Ages by a wide range of figures, including Peter Abelard, John of Salisbury, Roger Bacon, and John Buridan. Not only that, the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century was by no means unique. One could point to the Carolingian Renaissance much earlier, the Byzantine Renaissance, and many others. Our humanists then on this view were neither philosophers nor part of some unique renaissance or rebirth of learning. And so some medievalist commentators have argued we ought to drop the very idea of Renaissance philosophy altogether. Not only was nothing new happening, but the really interesting things that were happening, the scholastic Aristotelian tradition in the universities, was alive and well and continuing just as it had throughout the medieval period. So, how should we think about our humanists in relation to the subject of philosophy? It seems that perhaps they ought not to be counted as philosophers at all. And the labels that we often use to characterize these figures, whether that be humanist, Renaissance thinker, or Renaissance philosopher, have all been contested in various ways. Yet despite all of that, I think it's impossible to deny that these figures had a profound interest in philosophy. Petrarch discusses Stoic ideas in his Latin prose works, drawing on Cicero and Seneca. Leonardo Bruni translates works by Plato and Aristotle into Latin. He also writes, as we'll see later, a biography of Aristotle. Lorenzo Valla writes about pleasure and virtue, engaging with ancient debates between Epicureans and Stoics. Angelo Poliziano lectures on Aristotle's logic in Florence and translates the Enchiridion, the handbook of Epictetus, into Latin. Pico della Mirandola writes about Platonic metaphysics. Those are just a few high-profile examples of the philosophical interests of these figures. Now, what I want to argue is that Pierre Hadot's idea of philosophy as a way of life might offer us a useful framework in which to think about some of the philosophical interests of these figures. And in some ways, this should come as no great surprise, given that many of these humanists were reading exactly the same texts that Pierre Hadot's account of ancient philosophy is itself trying to understand. In particular, key sources for the Hellenistic schools of philosophy, along with works by the later Neoplatonists. Some of our humanists were also reading Aristotle, but from a slightly different perspective to the one prevalent in the scholastic tradition. Not only that, some of these figures explicitly reflected on the question of what philosophy was and argued that we ought to see it as a guide to how to live well, just as they thought it had been seen in antiquity. Okay, so this is potentially a vast topic, and obviously I don't have time to do it full justice now. What I want to do is just focus on a few examples to try to start to make my case. There are a number of loosely related points that I'd like to make. First, I think we ought to pay attention to how these thinkers conceived philosophy in order to try to understand them on their own terms. Secondly, I think also we need to acknowledge that in every period in the history of philosophy, there have been debates about what philosophy is. And it's not obvious that in any period, everyone straightforwardly agreed about what they thought philosophy was. That's not what philosophers do. They tend not to agree about everything. So it would be a mistake to claim what we might call meta-philosophical homogeneity in any period, including the Renaissance. And I guess that was effectively part of my argument in the paper that I gave yesterday. Thirdly, we also need to pay attention to the sources drawn on by these Italian thinkers. In the case of Marsilio Ficino, for instance, if we want to understand how he understood philosophy, we ought to pay some attention to the conception of philosophy in Plotinus and the later Neoplatonists that he was reading. In the case of Petrarch, we need to pay attention to the ancient philosophers that he was reading, not least Cicero and Seneca. If we can accept that some humanists, based on their close study of philosophers such as Cicero and Seneca, embraced an ancient conception of philosophy understood as a way of life or a guide to how to live well, then perhaps it becomes possible to reassess a number of the things that they were doing as well. Things that in the past have been dismissed as mere literary interests or activities. And these might include writing biographies of philosophers or writing letters of consolation to friends and associates. Suddenly, if we can look at these thinkers through this new lens, perhaps a much larger proportion of their work might start to look like philosophy. And so that's what I want to do. What I want to show is that some of these thinkers did see themselves as philosophers. They were shaped by this ancient model. That doesn't mean that everyone in the Renaissance, of course, was practicing philosophy as a way of life, but I hope I can show that a significant number of figures were. Okay, so let's move on. What I want to do is I can really break down into three main sections. The first section will be thinking about what philosophy is. The second section will be thinking about biographies or lives of philosophers. And the third section will be thinking in particular about questions to do with consolation and how philosophy might help people in times of need. So part one then. The first Renaissance text that I'd like to consider is a text by Petrarch entitled On His Own Ignorance, which was written in the 1360s. Now, this might be described as a polemic against contemporary Aristotelian philosophy. Not necessarily a polemic against Aristotle himself, because Petrarch is keen to stress that Aristotle's modern followers don't do justice to Aristotle himself. In particular, this text is a defense against charges that contemporary Aristotelians have brought against Petrarch himself, claiming that he had no great learning, which is to say, he wasn't sufficiently educated in scholastic philosophy. As such, he wasn't a proper philosopher, and so not qualified to contribute to contemporary philosophical debates. Now, in response to this, echoing Plato's apology of Socrates, Petrarch's response is to freely admit his own ignorance, while also drawing attention to the ignorance of his accusers. While his scholastically trained opponents ridicule Petrarch for his limited knowledge and lack of interest in Aristotle, Petrarch responds by attacking their unthinking commitment to the words of their hero. This is something that Petrarch finds faintly ridiculous. He writes, "I certainly believe that Aristotle was a great man who knew much, but he was human and could well be ignorant of some things, even many great things." Implicit here is the charge that these self-proclaimed scholastic philosophers take their uncritical admiration to such extremes that they effectively give up on independent thought altogether. Consequently, they're the ones that don't deserve the title of philosopher, Petrarch argues. Now, one of the striking features of Petrarch's polemic is his attack on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. Despite making a point of distinguishing between contemporary Aristotelians and Aristotle himself, Petrarch still doesn't have much positive to say about Aristotle's most famous ethical work. He claims that Aristotle knew nothing of true happiness. Now, in part, this is simply that Aristotle was a pagan, and so ignores what Petrarch, the good Christian, thinks to be the necessary conditions for true happiness, namely faith and belief in an immortal soul. But Petrarch's real argument against the Nicomachean ethics is that it fails to deliver on what it promises, namely teaching people how to become good. Reading Aristotle might make one more learned, but it will not make one better, he argues. The Nicomachean ethics lays out what virtue is, how to define it, and it teaches readers much in the realm of ethical theory, but it lacks the necessary punch to set readers on the path to virtue, Petrarch thinks. For that, readers will be much better reading Cicero, Seneca, or even a poet like Horace, whose maxims are far more memorable than anything Aristotle wrote, Petrarch claims. And Petrarch goes on to cite Socrates as the inspiration behind this primarily Latin tradition of philosophical moralizing that he wants to champion. And he thinks Aristotle openly hostile to this ultimately Socratic approach to philosophy. So what Petrarch proposes then, in the place of what he thinks of as Aristotle's theoretical approach to ethics, is this more practical approach focused on self-transformation. He writes, "The true moral philosophers and teachers of virtues are those whose first and last intention is to make the reader good." The goal of philosophy for Petrarch is not to know what virtue is, but to acquire it. And Petrarch's own knowledge of Socrates was thin, to say the least, and he never had the opportunity to read the Apology. But even so, there's what we might call a discernible Socratic spirit to his work, learned through these Latin authors that he was so interested in. Now, Petrarch's text is complex and is doing a number of things at once. For present purposes, the key point is that Aristotle's ethics is rejected because, despite its opening promise, it's seen as a work concerned with ethical knowledge and theory rather than self-transformation. This makes it clear that the contrast at work here is not one between moral philosophy on the one hand and the rest of philosophy on the other, but rather between two different conceptions of what philosophy is for. And the meta-philosophical claim is, I think, fairly clear. Philosophy is supposed to be an activity devoted to living well. And this conception of philosophy is ultimately a Socratic one, Petrarch argues. And he presents this as an alternative to the Aristotelian tradition of his day. Now, a number of these themes in Petrarch that Petrarch introduces are taken up and developed by Leonardo Bruni in the next century. Like Petrarch, Bruni thinks that the study of ancient authors is ultimately motivated by a desire for guidance in how to live. He also shares with Petrarch the view that it's possible to extract such guidance from a wide range of ancient authors. So in his work on the study of literature, written in the 1420s, Petrarch gives top priority to religious literature, and as Petrarch had done, singles out Augustine in particular for special mention. After that religious literature comes moral philosophy, described as the art of living well, and Bruni refers to the doctrines of Epicurus, Zeno, and also Aristotle, presenting all of them as offering valuable guidance in how to live. And just as Petrarch had suggested that further moral guidance might be found in the works of poets, such as Horace, Bruni also goes on to suggest that ancient historians, orators, and poets can also offer us useful moral lessons. Now, again, for present purposes, a couple of points are worth noting. The first is that Bruni sees a certain type of moral philosophy as something that can offer us guidance in how to live. And moreover, as something that we read for the sake of that guidance, rather than anything else. As he puts it elsewhere, all of these humanities disciplines, poetry, history, philosophy, are related to life and behavior and try to produce good men. Now, Bruni makes these points as part of an attempt to define what he famously calls studia humanitatis, rather than to define philosophy narrowly alone. But it's clear that he sees a certain type of philosophy as part of this wider educational project of self-transformation. Now, this idea that philosophy might contribute to a project of trying to live well echoes the description of Socrates' mission in the Apology. And this is a text that, unlike Petrarch, Bruni knew extremely well because he translated it into Latin. And we find further echoes of Socrates in Bruni's own treatise, The Introduction to Moral Philosophy. And in the opening line of this work, Bruni stresses that his central concern is not with mere living, but rather living well, echoing one of Socrates' famous sayings in the Crito, a text that Bruni also knew because he translated it into Latin. Dismissing natural philosophy as merely the accumulation of knowledge with no practical benefit, Bruni champions moral philosophy in particular, which he says involves paying attention to ourselves and to what properly belongs to us. Again, echoing Socrates' account in the Apology of taking care of ourselves. The distinction here, I think, is fairly plain. It's one between philosophy conceived as knowledge of nature that Bruni rejects versus philosophy conceived as a guide to how to live, an art of living. So Bruni's conception of philosophy is then, we might say, strikingly Socratic. But it's Socratic in an informed way, unlike Petrarch's, because he translated both the Apology and the Crito into Latin, as I said, and so had an intimate knowledge of Plato's account of Socrates. So that's one point worth noting in Bruni's model. The second point worth noting is that, unlike Petrarch, Bruni includes Aristotle alongside Epicureans and Stoics as an ancient philosopher who does offer useful guidance in how to live. He turns to Aristotle in his Introduction to Moral Philosophy, discussing Aristotle's account of the highest good alongside those of the Hellenistic schools, all of whom he sees contributing to an ultimately Socratic project of learning how to live well. And Bruni's account of moral philosophy is structured by the argument that we find in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So the first thing we have to do is to discuss whether there is a highest good to which all human actions point. And Aristotle's discussion of intrinsic goods and instrumental goods that seem to leave Petrarch so cold is instead a central part of Bruni's project. He follows this with an account of the Stoic conception of the highest good and seeks to minimize the distance between the peripatetic and the Stoic positions in a manner that reminds us of Antiochus, as recounted in Book 5 of Cicero's De Finibus. It's clear then that Bruni shares Petrarch's broadly Socratic conception of philosophy as an activity devoted to living well. Bruni also downplays the value of pursuing theoretical knowledge that has no direct impact on how one might attain happiness. Where they differ, as we've seen, is that Bruni sees Aristotle's ethical works as offering a valuable contribution to this project. And this again, no doubt, reflects Bruni's detailed knowledge of the Nicomachean Ethics, which, like the Crito and the Apology, he translated into Latin. Indeed, in Bruni's own biography of Aristotle, written to counteract what he thought was the negative image of Aristotle presented in Diogenes Laertius, Bruni presents Aristotle as a master in ethics, but also rhetoric and politics and poetics, barely mentioning the theoretical works that dominated the reception of Aristotle in the scholastic tradition, in particular the metaphysics and the De Anima. Bruni's version of Aristotle then was, in effect, a humanist, interested in moral philosophy, rhetoric, and poetry. And this leads us on to the second theme that I'd like to discuss, namely an interest in the biographies of ancient philosophers that a number of the humanists had. Now, at first glance, this might look like an entirely historical or scholarly concern with not any direct relevance to philosophy as such. If you're interested in real philosophy, you're interested in the philosophical arguments, you don't care about what Aristotle got up to during the course of his life. Why would that be of any interest, right? The kind of common traditional view. But if anyone thinks that philosophy ought to be understood as a guide to how to live, then perhaps attending to how philosophers did actually live might suddenly start to look far more relevant. As Cicero once said, we ought to judge a writer not merely from what they wrote, but also from their acts, their words, their character, and their life. So with this in mind, let's stay with Leonardo Bruni a little longer. As I just said, he wrote his own biography of Aristotle, completing it in the 1430s. Now, this was prompted by the prospect of the lives of the philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, which included a biography of Aristotle, entering wider circulation because it was about to be translated by Traversari into Latin. And Diogenes Laertius's portrait of Aristotle was far from complimentary. In Diogenes' account, Aristotle is presented as a largely ungrateful pupil of Plato, who was embroiled in a number of sexual scandals, fled Athens in disgrace, and ultimately committed suicide. Now, Bruni, already a fan of Aristotle since translating the Nicomachean Ethics some 15 years earlier, wants to counter this unflattering portrait by writing his own account of Aristotle's life and getting it into circulation before the Latin version of Diogenes Laertius could do too much damage to Aristotle's reputation in Italy. At the same time, he wants to promote his distinctively humanistic image of Aristotle, both to reappropriate Aristotle from the scholastic tradition, but also to defend Aristotle against the sorts of criticisms made by earlier humanists, such as Petrarch, that we saw earlier. So Bruni's Aristotle is quite different from the image of Aristotle that we tend to have today, and how Aristotle was seen by Bruni's scholastic contemporaries. Following Cicero, Bruni presents Aristotle as both the model of eloquence and a master of rhetoric. Bruni lists Aristotle's works at the end of his biography and focuses his list on Aristotle's works in ethics, politics, rhetoric, and poetics, all standard humanist interests. And he barely mentions works such as the metaphysics that were central to the scholastic Aristotelian tradition. And Bruni's reliance on Cicero also led to some doctrinal shifts, it's been claimed, because according to one commentator, Bruni follows Cicero in ascribing to Aristotle belief in an individual immortal soul, in contrast to the then prevalent Averroist interpretation of the De Anima that dominated in the Italian universities that denied individual immortality to Aristotle's account. In both of these cases, then, Bruni prioritizes Cicero's reports of Aristotle's now lost published dialogues over the unpublished lecture notes that we know Aristotle from today. Now, why did all this matter so much to Bruni? I think the answer is that he wanted to present Aristotle as a humanist role model, which is to say, a guide to a certain way of life. And for Aristotle to be convincing in such a role, he must be seen to have lived an exemplary life. Now, Bruni was not the only person to become inspired by the recovery and translation of Diogenes Laertius. Around the same time, Gaurino of Verona composed a biography of Plato. Gaurino was a contemporary of Bruni's, and his biography of Plato dates also from around 1430. While Bruni's life of Aristotle has been described by commentators as a remarkable achievement, one commentator has described Gaurino's life of Plato as sadly mediocre. Even so, it stands as the first modern biography of Plato based on ancient sources. And it was quickly followed by a number of others, including one, unsurprisingly, by Marsilio Ficino. Now, Ficino's Life of Plato also drew heavily on Diogenes Laertius, supplemented with information from a number of other sources, and of course, from Plato's own dialogues that Ficino translated into Latin. The final version of his biography was completed in the 1470s to function as an introduction to his translation of Plato's dialogues. The study of the biography of the philosopher is presented here as an important preparation for the study of their doctrines. In his preface, Ficino describes his biography as an attempt to, I quote, paint the ideal form of a philosopher, adding that through this, one may see equally the philosopher and the philosophy. Echoing a common theme in antiquity, he adds that this image of a philosopher, of a philosophical life, is naturally something second best when compared to the example of a living figure. And there are two key points, I think, to draw from Ficino's brief opening remarks. First, the person of the philosopher and the subject of philosophy are more or less to be identified as one of the same thing, he seems to be arguing. And secondly, the best way to comprehend philosophy is via an encounter with a philosopher who's living a philosophical life. And if that's not possible, the next best thing is to study the lives of those philosophers through their biographies. Now, although Ficino does not explicitly comment on this, there's clearly a connection between his desire to write a biography of Plato and the ancient Neoplatonic tradition of prefacing the study of the dialogues with the study of Plato's life. Ficino takes from that tradition the Socratic conception of philosophy as care of the soul that results in a transformation of one's way of life. In that tradition, the goal is not to learn philosophy, but to become a philosopher. And as Ficino would have it, an idealized image of Plato himself is itself the ideal form of what a philosopher is. Put in those terms, it would be absurd to embark on the project of trying to become a philosopher without first studying an image of what one hopes to become. Okay, so those are some reasons why biographies of philosophers might start to look really important if you think what you're trying to do is embark on living a philosophical life. Now, the third theme I want to touch on is to look at some direct practical examples of what philosophy understood as a guide to life in this period might actually involve. In order to do this, I want to look at some examples of what I shall call philosophical consolation. Now, not all works of consolation are philosophical. So by philosophical consolation, I mean an attempt to offer a remedy for some kind of perceived misfortune. This might be loss of property or reputation, bereavement, exile. These were all common examples in this period. To offer some kind of remedy for these things by the use of philosophical argument. And these might be arguments questioning the value of the thing lost, and so the appropriateness of the feeling of misfortune, or it might be an argument about the appropriateness of emotional responses in general, or it might be arguments about the necessity or inevitability of the perceived misfortune. Now, some of these will draw on aspects of ethical theory, while others might involve reference to natural philosophy. One of the defining characteristics of this sort of philosophical consolation is the idea that the person in the state of distress has made some kind of mistake, right? They've either overly valued some external thing, They wish things to be other than they must necessarily be, or they're behaving contrary to human nature. These are errors that ought to be corrected for their own sakes and not merely in order to reduce their suffering. And one of the functions of philosophical consolation then is to show that a mistake has been made and that the distress being suffered is due to this error in judgment, rather than anything that's taken place in the external world. Now, that humanists and philosophers in this period considered consolation to be an important task for philosophy, I think also tells us something interesting about how they conceived philosophy as an activity. And let me quickly run through some specific examples. So let's go back to Petrarch. Following ancient examples, Petrarch wrote a number of letters of consolation to friends during times of distress. And he also engaged in self-consolation, following the example of Cicero. His most significant contribution was his large work on remedies for both kinds of fortune. And this is a substantial work taking the form of a series of dialogues devoted to the topic of how to deal with both good and bad fortune. It was written in the 1350s and 1360s and draws heavily on Cicero's Tusculan disputations. Now, although presented in dialogue form, it's not a series of conversation between characters, but instead it's a back and forth between reason on the one hand and the emotions of joy, hope, sorrow, and fear on the other. In the first half, reason debates with joy and hope, while in the second half, reason takes on sorrow and fear. And these four types of emotion are, roughly speaking, the canonical negative emotions in Stoicism, which were discussed at length by Cicero in the Tusculan disputations. All four emotions are the product of fortune, in a sense. Joy and hope come about in times of prosperity, while sorrow and fear accompany adversity. Now, the central thesis of the work as a whole is that people need remedies for both kinds of fortune, both good and bad. And in this, Petrarch takes up a theme that we find in one of Seneca's essays on providence, in which Seneca argues that some of the greatest dangers come from excessive good fortune. The dangers of good fortune in particular are twofold. It makes us weak and lazy, untested by the challenges of adversity, and it makes it harder for us to deal with genuine adversity when it finally comes, which it inevitably will. Now, between these two books on remedies, there are over 250 short dialogues between reason and these four emotions. Let me mention just a couple. In book 2, chapter 9, reason responds to the complaints of sorrow against fortune. It's a mistake to think that fortune can rob one of anything, because all that fortune does is take back what already belongs to her. This echoes the ancient Stoic claim that whatever someone has is merely on loan and must eventually be returned. Fortune is powerless to take away the real essentials of life, because the thing that's most essential for a good life is, of course, virtue, which is outside of fortune's control. And although there might be some basic physical necessities required, poverty is often a matter of perspective, Petrarch argues. And once you've attained virtue, you don't feel the stresses of poverty any longer, because true riches reside in a virtuous mind. So the contrast then is between external goods on the one hand and inner virtue on the other, and the mistaken way in which people often attribute value to the former external goods instead of the latter virtue. The dangers of good fortune are equally important to address. When in book 1, Joy proclaims the benefits of possessing wealth. Reason responds by warning of the envy, danger, and burdens that come with it. Friends can no longer be trusted. What's been fought hard to acquire is going to require even more work to retain and will generate suffering when it's eventually lost. It's easy to think that great wealth will solve all of our problems and bring peace of mind, but in fact, reason suggests those in honest poverty are often much happier. While those experiencing good fortune might not require much consolation, they nevertheless need philosophical therapy for their misplaced satisfaction. So for Petrarch then, philosophical consolation is focused on attending to our ascriptions of value, explicitly drawing on ancient Stoicism. Now, as we've seen, Petrarch's consolations for fortune are based on a broadly Stoic worldview. His great admirer, Coluccio Salutati, for many years Chancellor of Florence, shared that Stoic worldview, at least in the early part of his life, albeit qualified by some aspects of his commitment to Christian doctrine. However, when he was put to the test, Salutati found Stoicism wanting as a foundation for real consolation. And that test came relatively late in his life when his son died. His friend and correspondent, Francesco Zabarella, sent Salutati a letter of consolation, drawing on the Stoic ideas that Salutati had himself openly expressed. But in the midst of bereavement, Salutati found these ideas unconvincing, if not insensitive, and wrote a lengthy reply to Zabarella's letter. And in this letter, Salutati challenged the Stoic claim that death is not an evil. While accepting that morally death is neither good nor bad, he nevertheless insisted that naturally it remains an evil insofar as it's a privation of the goodness of life. Drawing on Aristotle, Salutati argues that things that we fear are evils. We fear death, so death must be an evil. This, he suggests, is a plainly evident fact, to be contrasted with what he calls the cold-heartedness and unattainable logic of the Stoics. Death, then, for Salutati is a privation and as such a genuine evil. Correspondingly, he argued, it's a legitimate source of sorrow. Although it might be inevitable, Salutati insists that reflection on this fact can in no way function as a form of consolation. The general fact of mortality does not alter the legitimacy of our sorrow in individual cases. And indeed, he goes on to challenge not just the Stoic claims on this topic, but the very idea of philosophical consolation itself. No rational argument, he suggests, can undo the emotion of grief, or for that matter, any other emotion. Whatever philosophy promises with its lessons on consolation, he writes, these emotions cannot be removed. They're only relieved by the passage of time. In any case, someone in the grip of a severe emotion cannot be reasoned with, and on this the Stoics would agree. So philosophy can offer nothing to someone in the grip of the emotional state of sorrow. And although the Stoics claim to offer therapy for emotions after someone has calmed down, Salutati claims that this is simply disingenuous. It's the passing of time that does the work. Grief is simply a process that one has to go through. So Salutati then is skeptical about the value of philosophical consolation in general in the face of bad fortune. The ideas that he admired for much of his life failed when put to the test. Or perhaps we might say he failed them. His case shows the way in which these ancient ideas were not merely of academic or literary interest. They were literally being put to the test in the most challenging of life circumstances. As Seneca had said, it's one thing to offer consolation to others in grief, but it's quite another thing to try to console oneself in the face of bereavement. But despite Salitati's claim to have shown the limits of philosophical consolation, the idea remained a topic of widespread interest amongst subsequent humanists in the 15th century. One of those humanists was Poggio Bracciolini, a protege of Salitati, who would also go on to become Chancellor of Florence. Towards the end of his life, he wrote a work on the misery of the human condition, prompted by the fall of Constantinople in 1453. That text is a dialogue between Poggio, another humanist, and Cosimo de' Medici. And it too engages with ancient consolatory literature, drawing in particular on Seneca. The opening dedication is emphatic that all human misery is due to our desire for the gifts of fortune. Given that fortune is by nature fickle and uncertain, the only way to escape human misery is to rein in those desires. Whether fortune is going to be good or bad, human suffering will inevitably follow. The wealthy will live in fear of losing their riches. The powerful will fear their political opponents. No one is content. Unlike his mentor Salitati, though, Poggio suggests that philosophical consolation might indeed be able to help. The misery of the human condition is not inevitable, and philosophy can offer a cure. It's only by pursuing so-called external goods, the goods of fortune, that people expose themselves to this sort of misery, he argues. But there's an alternative, a philosophical life devoted to the pursuit of virtue. And as in the case of Petrarch, it's by attending to ascriptions of value, of what we think has value and what doesn't, that such suffering can be overcome. Now, a little later, let me mention another example. In the 1460s, Bartolomeo Scala, who will also go on to become the Chancellor of Florence. This is our third Chancellor of Florence. He also writes a dialogue of consolation, this time addressed to Lorenzo de' Medici in response to the death of his uncle, Giovanni. Although the dialogue is presented to Lorenzo de' Medici, Scala opens the text by saying that his motivation was in part to offer consolation to himself. The process of writing would itself have functioned as a sort of spiritual exercise for Scala, helping him to keep in check his own sorrow, as well as offering consolation for others who might read it later. He begins by insisting that sorrow is a natural human response to the loss of a loved one, and he doubts whether any kind of philosophical consolation could alleviate this quite natural reaction. One of his reasons for engaging Cosimo in discussion is the equanimity that he managed to display in the face of such a loss. Indeed, it's the topic of human nature that guides their subsequent discussion in the dialogue. For any kind of philosophical consolation must be grounded on a proper understanding of what it is to be human. Now, Scala's text draws on philosophical discussions about value, about the relationship between the body and the soul, and on wider metaphysics that these presuppose, all in order to develop his own version of philosophical consolation. The Platonic themes in this discussion mark a move away from the consolatory tradition of the earlier humanists we discussed that were much more drawing on Stoic themes from Seneca and Cicero. And we see that shift towards Platonic themes continue in the work of Ficino. So around a decade after Scala writes his dialogue, Ficino writes a letter of consolation to Gismondo della Stufa, whose fiancée tragically died the day before their planned wedding. Like Scala, the consolation Ficino offers was resolutely Platonic. It's the soul that's the real person, not the body, which is a mere shadow. And by withdrawing into one soul, it's possible to commune with the soul of another via an act of contemplation of the idea of that person. And this idea is far more beautiful than the transient physical form that's just been lost. Elsewhere, Ficino reflects more widely on coping with bad fortune, again drawing heavily on Platonism. A human is composed of a soul and a body, and while the soul is in kinship with God, the body is part of the material universe. The former is guided by providence, while the latter is subject to fate. As a consequence, the soul is free from the vicissitudes of fate, or at least has the potential to be, so long as it doesn't become too strongly attached to the body. And so the way to escape the violence of fate is to withdraw from the body and focus on the life of the mind, as you'd expect any good Neoplatonist to argue. Two letters from the 1490s make explicit that it's philosophy that is the antidote to fortune. The life of the philosopher is all too often marked by poverty, Ficino says. No philosopher will ever be rich, and rich men cannot easily become philosophers, he writes. But this is of no concern to someone who places value in virtue rather than external circumstances. Similarly, according to Aristotle, intelligence and good fortune seem to be mutually exclusive, and the philosopher is happy to embrace intelligence at the expense of good fortune, Ficino argues. So again, the way to escape the vicissitudes of fortune is to embrace a philosophical way of life, focused on the cultivation of wisdom and taking care of one's soul. On such a life, fortune can leave no mark. So here we see the way in which the philosophical position underpinning a particular consolatory argument can lead to specific recommendations about how to live. Ficino's broadly Platonic, Aristotelian, Neoplatonic tone suggests a life of withdrawal focused on intellectual contemplation, quite different from the more stoic and cynic responses embraced by some of the other earlier humanists, drawing on Seneca and Cicero. Okay, so let me quickly pull all threads together. It should perhaps become as no great surprise that these Renaissance humanists became so interested in philosophical consolation, given the texts that they were reading. Notwithstanding the rediscovery of previously lost texts in both Greek and Latin, the already well-known philosophical works of Cicero and Seneca remain key points of reference for all of these humanist thinkers. In particular, Cicero's Tusculan Disputations and its account of remedies for emotions. And in the Tusculan Disputations, Cicero defined philosophy as a medicine for the soul, mapping out a common therapeutic project shared by the majority of ancient philosophers who came after Socrates. It was Socrates who had defined philosophy as a task concerned with taking care of the soul. As we've seen, Petrarch took up this conception of philosophy as an alternative to the scholastic tradition, setting the agenda for subsequent humanists. And this same Socratic model also stands behind the Platonic approach taken up by Scala and Ficino. Its image of philosophy as medicine for the soul and a guide to how to live was thus always in the background, we might say. All the Renaissance thinkers that I've mentioned were effectively committed to the view that philosophy was able to offer genuine consolation for people facing adversity, Salutati perhaps being the exception. And the philosophical solutions that they offered it involved dramatic changes to an individual's way of life, whether that be giving up allegiance to one's hometown, rejecting the importance of material possessions, reining in one's political ambition, neglecting the demands of the body, or withdrawing into a life of contemplation. And as we've seen, different philosophical positions champion different elements. In the Renaissance, many thinkers embraced these ideas, and their interest in the consolatory power of philosophy in particular was but one expression, I'd like to suggest, of a wider commitment to this idea that philosophy was a practical tool for transforming how one lived. So I've tried to argue then that the humanists that I've touched on, working in the light of their careful attention to these ancient texts, take up this conception of philosophy as a way of life that they found in the text they were reading. And this is quite different from the understanding of philosophy that many modern historians hold, whether implicitly or explicitly. What our humanists find in Cicero, Seneca, Plato, the Neoplatonists, and depending on how you read him, Aristotle, was an image of philosophy devoted to self-transformation. And this is shaped by their understanding of philosophy and what it meant to be a philosopher. And by paying attention to these sorts of issues about how philosophy was conceived, and indeed how the humanists reflected on what they thought philosophy was, I think we can see that they do indeed deserve to be counted as serious philosophers. Thank you.